Mr. Speaker, Manitobans, who are no strangers to floods, are continually being surprised by the lack of proactive planning by the NDP government for communities which are very susceptible to flooding.
They're reactive.
The Peguis First Nation today, as in many previous years, is on the front lines of the flood fight in our province.
Neglected.
Flood forecasts from the province in February and in March reported the risk of flooding at Peguis along the Fisher River to be from minor to moderate, and this directly affects the level of funding and their preparedness for the flood. I ask the Premier, does he consider the evacuation of more than 130 people from Peguis only a minor or a moderate problem?
Speaker, the evacuation of anybody from their homes in a spring flood is a tragic situation for that family, and in our view unnecessary, particularly when we have an opportunity to do the right thing in communities like Peguis, move the homes that are at risk. There was a commitment by the federal government to move 75 homes. Only about 12 of them have been moved so far. We think it's essential that you have a mitigation program, which we're prepared to participate in on a province-wide basis, Mr. Speaker, that you have a mitigation program that allows people to relocate their homes into safe locations. And we very much want to be a part of that solution anywhere in Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we're doing. One of the first announcements we made last year in the spring budget was $250 million to make the emergency channel permanent in Lake St. Martin, to build an additional channel out of Lake Manitoba, and to put in place resources to help those communities where people are still out of their homes to rebuild on higher land with better infrastructure and better housing so they will never have to experience that again. We wish the same thing for the people of Peguis as well, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, mislabeling the flood potential for flooding as minor to moderate when there's a major flood makes it very difficult for the community to prepare for and get adequate resources to deal well with the major flood which has happened this year. This is vitally important for Peguis because flooding can come very quickly, which means excellent advanced preparation is crucial. For more than 14 years, this NDP government has not prioritized flood protection for Peguis. I ask the Premier, will he investigate to see if the flood forecasting at Peguis can be much better in the future? And when will there be an effective long-run flood protection plan in place for this community?
Speaker, there have been plans put in place to help homes that were in the way of floods to be moved. They need to be implemented, and they need to be resourced by the federal government. Our flood forecasting, we've improved investments in technology. We've got over 100 years of experience in our flood forecasting office. As we know, we've hired a new flood forecaster with excellent reputation and qualifications at the PhD level in Manitoba, highly endorsed by his advisor, and we give the best information that is available to us to all communities. And we always know that every spring it's going to be a challenge, particularly in areas that are on low-lying land that are at risk. And we want to work with those communities to make sure they're as well prepared as possible for the threat of immediate floods and have a plan for the long-term prevention of flooding in their communities. That's exactly what we're doing all around Manitoba. That's why we put extraordinary resources in place to rebuild flood protection in communities all throughout Manitoba, and all the members opposite, including the member from River Heights, have voted against those additional resources to protect communities, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier repeatedly blames the federal government. Manitobans know nature doesn't play this same political territory game, and people are suffering because of it.
Every year, you don't care.
If an all-party task force was needed to go to Ottawa to fight for these Manitobans, the Premier could have asked for it, but he hasn't. In more than 14 years of this NDP government, there still is not even a date for when the effective flood protection plan for communities like Peguis will be in place so people don't have to be evacuated year after year. Besides disappointment, what can Manitobans expect from this NDP government when it comes to flood protection for Peguis? When will it be there?
We will continue to advocate on behalf of that community for better flood protection. That's fundamental. Those people were dislocated, relocated from very good land further south in Manitoba, and it took them decades to get compensated for the loss of that land. And the land they were put on was land that's at high risk of flooding. We know that there needs to be investments there. We provided them with resources for additional super sandbags Tiger dams, Mr. Speaker, but we know the long-term solution is the proper investment in infrastructure to move homes and to protect that community with better flood protection. We support that. We have supported that year over year. We will continue to advocate for that, Mr. Speaker, but the member opposite was a member of the federal government. He had a chance to put protection in place for those communities, and he failed to do that, Mr. Speaker.